This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
We're delighted to have Joël Proust from Paris, but also Andreas Roepstorff from Aarhus. Why not just go directly to the source? And let me tell you a little bit about Andreas. He's a professor in cognition and communication in the Department of Culture and Society and in the Department of Clinical Medicine at Aarhus. He works between anthropology, neurobiology, some philosophy and linguistics. He was trained, though, in social anthropology and started to study as an anthropologist interdisciplinarity in the wild, actually watching it work and seeing how people behaved. And I think it's fair to say that Andreas is the go-to man for interdisciplinarity. He's advised many research councils around the world. He has always been called upon to give thoughts and to communicate ideas. He's thought about this from a theoretical and practical point of view, and also now advises his own university on the setting up of interdisciplinarity programs and collaborations. He also is the director of Interacting Minds, the Interacting Minds Centre at Aarhus, and is involved in a number of transdisciplinarity collaborations and has had major grants to be in charge of. So we thought he was an ideal person to come and talk to you. We should say, just in the interest of fairness, that I hadn't originally spotted, but eventually spotted that he's a potential collaborator for the project that Phil Davis introduced you to earlier. But we didn't think that at all debarred him from having so many disciplines under his belt and so much experience of it from coming and talking to you. So welcome and thank you for coming, Andreas.
Thank you very much, Barry, for this extremely kind introduction. It's almost an intimidating audience to speak to. There are so many competences in the room and so much experience in the room. And what I thought I would try to do was to kind of give you some practice-based cases of situations where interdisciplinarity has worked for us and situations where it hasn't worked, maybe to give some food for thought and some possibilities for discussions. Now, as Barry pointed out, I've kind of been dragged into doing a lot of interdisciplinarity. I first trained both in biology and social anthropology, and I simply couldn't really decide between them. And in the end, I ended up having 2 degrees and always feeling a loss when I was only doing one of them. And then I did a research project where I did kind of anthropology in and off the cognitive sciences and brain imaging. And then one of the sites that I studied, they'd say, well, why don't you join us instead of studying? So we'll hire you and you will help us to set up some research. And they had a degree in neurobiology. It wasn't completely off the target. And I then became involved in organizing the cognitive research at the brain imaging facility in Aarhus. And then at some point, the European Science Foundation got interested in looking at consciousness, and we came up with a project called BASIC, Brain Agency, Self-Intersubjectivity and Consciousness. Acronyms are important. Patrick Hager was one of the plugins in it, and met up with Joël Proust there. And that was the first kind of experience with what goes on at a European level when you both have to coordinate between people in your group and meet up with people from elsewhere. And then I got involved in setting up a humanities and European research agenda work group on understanding and misunderstanding that should say something about, how could one study that. And then for various reasons, I became in Norway involved in a program on ethical, legal and societal aspects of all sorts of novel technologies. And then in Denmark, for reasons I really can't understand, I became involved in funding that type of research, so the Strategic Research Council for bio, nano, and technologies, and then some stuff in Aarhus. And I'm not giving you this list to kind of boost the CV, but mainly to try to give an idea of kind of the different places that I have somehow ended up in working across interdisciplinary settings. And what I'm trying to give to you today is drawing on some of the experiences from these different settings and what seems to work, what doesn't seem to work, what's the difference from seeing these things from, let's say, a funding body that basically funds technological research but is interested in interdisciplinarity, or humanities project that wants to draw the sciences in. So please ask questions along the way and from any of these perspectives. Now you could say the third thing to think about interdisciplinarity is it's very much also a matter of a group of people doing stuff together. And the first question in the images are kind of important, right? Is it what we think of? Is it interdisciplinarity is something that's weak, woolly, and soft? You can find people coming up with that idea of it, and there are certainly instances that I've been involved in and also organized it that had that feeling, right? That in the end nothing really came out of it. But there can also be situations where the interdisciplinary research has a completely different feeling. So it feels much more like some kind of a combat unit. It's about being tough, sharp, and hard, and having almost a command-like structure with particular competences that you bring together in order to do things. And I think in the current way that we are thinking about it, what seems to work in the interdisciplinary groups are those where you almost think of as a combat unit, of having specific competences in together that can do stuff together. And it can be tough and unpleasant at times for each other, but that's also part of it. Something that we have come across again and again is that once you do the interdisciplinarity, there are many different ways that you can, in a way, cut the cake. The first projects I was involved in were basically organized around the technology. That was the time that, as colleagues suggested, when brain scanners were suddenly coming up, and people from all sorts of disciplines were kind of running to the scanners to figure out what could you do with them. So in a way, the focal point became something about these new technologies and the type of things that would be relevant with these technologies, depending on whether you were a physicist or a philosopher, a linguist, or someone with a political perspective. And I can see kind of incidentally the majority of the projects I've been involved in over the last couple of years seems to, in a way, slice the cake in the other dimension. And increasingly, the groups we're organizing and involved in are more topically based. So it's really about identifying something that interests people and then coming at it from very different disciplines and very different backgrounds. And there are certainly advantages and disadvantages to those places, but really depending on the type of things you're doing, I think you're going to see very different dynamics as to what is it that brings you together. Is it a question of a technology that unites one, or is it really a matter of a topic or an issue that seems the critical part of it? Now we've kind of developed some, you can almost call them basic tools of interdisciplinarity that we kind of talk about when new people come to our place, and they work as potentially as guiding principles. It doesn't quite work in terms of what does it take then to start doing some kind of interdisciplinarity. I'll briefly run over them and go over them with some examples. There is an issue about triangulation, there is an issue about front loading, there is an issue about styling that seems to work as ways of covering it up. And if we begin with triangulation, the basic idea of triangulation goes back to medieval times, the mapping of Europe, and the idea that if you wanted to do a cartography of the landscape, and you knew the position of 2 or 3 church towers, and you could see a 4th church tower from between, and then by knowing the angles and directions to that unknown church tower, it was possible to kind of map out that unknown territory around the place. And then my first attempt at doing some kind of interdisciplinary work together with Toby Jack in London more than 10 years ago, and we thought of things like relating phenomenology and behavioral data and brain imaging as a process of triangulation. Ideally, we have someone inside a scanner, and maybe we would get at what it was like by both asking people about the experience of it and then doing some brain scans of it and looking at their reports, etc. And what we proposed to rethink was that if you were to look at cognitive experiments, maybe one could think of it as a methodological triangulation, whereby combining these different dimensions and domains, one could get at a better understanding of the situation. You see a younger version of Tony and me, and it's quite clear also that if you look at our kind of publication record after that, we haven't really succeeded in doing it. It sounds really nice, but doing it in practice seems really, really difficult. And what has become, I think, more apparent to us if we have tried to do it, is that in contrast to what goes on if you map out the geography, is that you're not really shooting at the target from the same ground. Basically, you're shooting at it from very different positions. The world look kind of different from these positions, And in many situations, the situation is that the evidence actually points in different directions depending on where you're getting at it. And that makes that kind of mapping exercise a much more complex one. And that simple metaphor of triangulation just doesn't seem to work out here. One thing we were particularly concerned about in that instance was the intersubjectivity, how much the shared understanding would be shaping both the brain scans and the experiences associated with something. And that was just giving us an early hint of why is it actually that triangulation might work well as a first metaphor, but doesn't give you a guiding principle for what it would like to do. So triangulation is a nice idea, but don't think that it works. The other notion that we kind of keep telling each other that one should think about is a notion stolen from the philosopher of cognitive science, John Gallagher, who in a special issue we edited came up with the notion of front-loading. And front-loading is, he discussed it in relationship to phenomenology. At that time there were many discussions about could you take ideas from phenomenology and neuroscience of the mind. And Sean identified 3 ways that one could do that. One would be what he called neurophenomenology. So you would basically study people who had a lot of phenomenology training and then ask them what it was like to do something and then correlate that with their brain scans and then you come up with the answer. That didn't really work. The second approach, Sean said, was something we call indirect phenomenology. So you do an experiment, and then after the experiment you try to do some post-hoc phenomenology, explaining the type of results that came out with it. It's incredibly successful in terms of publications. Many studies out there are done in that particular way, but it kind of goes against a lot of standard principles of the scientific method. And then the third approach that Sean was advocating was what he called front-loading phenomenology. So you could basically take any other discipline in phenomenology and think about front-loading it. And the idea there was then to take some kind of, in this instance, results of phenomenological investigations and turn that into the critical turning points around the experimental investigations. And Sean has a lot of nice arguments about why this is the way you can think about it. It's not about doing phenomenology on the people running experiments, but it's really kind of identifying from one discipline some critical issues that you front load into the design of it. And again here you can say, well, it sounds as a beautiful idea, but is that really any different from any other good design practice? I think this is what is done inside of most scientific disciplines already, and we just give it a different name once you report it across disciplines here. In most instances, there seems to be 2 strategies of research that can work. One is to have a fairly precise idea about what you want to study, and then do whatever you have to control for that idea. But that idea has to come from somewhere, and it's not really that different whether it comes across disciplines rather than within disciplines. So there's also an alternative approach that seems to work well, particularly also in these days of massive data mining, and that is to go completely open-ended and then see what happens in an experiment. And then usually you have to follow that up by a more hypothesis idea. So this just to say that, yeah, the notion of front-loading is a useful conceptual tool, but it's not really revolutionizing that also. But I can give you one instance of where we tried quite explicitly to front-load an idea into an experiment. Durkheim, one of the fathers of sociology, had in the 1910s, he described the notion of collective effervescence, and that's the idea that when people kind of get together, they produce an exceptionally powerful stimulant. So when in harmony and unison of movement, people, by performing rituals together, get into some kind of a shared experience. It can be very strong, be almost electrifying. And a group of people from our research group, headed by Dimitris Galas as an anthropologist, and Rana Tomalinga, a person to data analysis, they went up to a small field site in Spain. Dimitris is an anthropologist that studied firewalking rituals all over the world. And he knew about this particular village in Spain where the whole village and everyone related to it gets together on the longest day of the year in a stadium built for the purpose, and they light a big fire and it burns all during the day, and in the evening you have basically a thick layer of glowing coal. And then people from the village walk across these coals here, often carrying relatives on their shoulders. And the idea then was to say, well, are there then any kind of physiological markers of what Durkheim called collective effervescence? Does that really translate into something that you can track in biology? And what we did here was then to basically strap up some of the people who were doing the firewalking and some spectators with those related and unrelated to the walkers, with very simple pulse measures as you use in physiological training. And what you see up there on the graphs are the curves in red of the firewalker and in blue of his wife. And the guy does the firewalk where you see the strong line, and not surprising, before he has to do the firewalk, his pulse goes up. He has to do something perceivably painful and maybe not that pleasant. But very interestingly, you see a very parallel pattern also with his wife looking at. And at the green line, the brother of the firewalker is doing some kind of a relative, is doing the kind of job here. So in an interesting ways, we can see that just looking at simple measures of physiology as an index of the autonomic nervous system, it seems as if physiological states are shared, although the actual bodily states are not shared. I mean, one does the walking and the other does the doing. We could see that kind of pattern when we looked across all the different pairs and couplings, but we really didn't have any way of how we could quantify it until we made up with the late Norton, who knew about new ways of doing time series analysis called recurrence plot and cross-recurrence plots, which are very sophisticated ways of basically plotting two time series against each other and then see are there recurring patterns in the activity. And here is a recurrence plot of its firewalk, and it's the time on this axis, and on this axis the diagonal line is identical time. And you can basically point out the time when the ritual starts in red and the time as well as its firewalk in blue from just looking at recurring patterns in hardware. And the same can actually be done for a related spectator, whereas an unrelated spectator just doesn't seem to have any kind of structure, any kind of stuff. So the argument here was to say, well, we would start out with this basic idea from Durkheim. There is something about doing these things together that does something in people. And that maybe looking at the autonomic nervous system might be a very crude and dirty proxy of some of these processes. And then try to use that to ask the question, what goes on in these bodies during these experiences? And it turned out that the major line was between those not related to the firewall and those related to the firewall, and not so much between whether you actually did the firewall or not. Now, to an anthropologist, this is kind of old hat that confirms what people usually say, that in ritual activity, it's not just about doing the activity, it's actually something that transforms the group as such. But in this particular perspective, we thought it was interesting. The third idea that we kind of keep saying that people should be worrying about, thinking about when they do interdisciplinary research is the notion of styling, kind of recognizing that whatever you do, when you do knowledge production, goes on within a particular style. The idea is Nick from the Effect, who is a Polish Jewish immunologist and philosopher of science working mainly in the 1830s. And he came up with a pre-cool, in many ways, much more interesting idea to say that empirically, kind of within thought communities that support them, people develop a certain thought styles, which provides you with a directed perception and corresponding mental and objective assimilation of what has been so perceived. It is characterized by common features in the problems of interest, by the judgments of the thought collective considers obvious, and by the methods it applies as a means of acquiring knowledge. And also it's accompanied by a technical and literary style characteristic of the system research. So Fleck was kind of making the empirical observation that when you work, or when you look across different groups of people working within particular fields, then within the groups there seems to be a lot of unity in how they think of something as being right or wrong and how they want to which method counts. But it looks really different as you move across fields. And this is something that we can see that we come across again and again whenever you do cross or inter-transdisciplinary work, that these issues of style becomes an issue. And we're trying to create in ourselves some kind of sensitivity to, well, which kind of technical and literary style are you actually going to be writing in? What is it that one does when one works across styles? You can have different strategies. You can try to negate it, one might try to integrate it, and also try to segregate, so basically writing up the same stuff into different styles. And this is kind of the final, it's almost like an experiment in it, and the way that you see the results here is in what will the arbiters of taste also want to review it? Which kind of comments are they giving you when you're trying to submit the kind of work? So there was, I think, a lot of good insights to get out of Fleck. The way to update him today was that for Fleck, the idea was that these styles were very much the minds and heads of people. It was something we couldn't think outside. And I think the current version of that would be that it's much more something that's out there. It's out in the institutions. It's something that you have to deal with and train, but also on get into literary journals. But as a person, you can, and particularly as a group, you can develop some kind of flexibility to be aware of those different aspects of styling, both the knowledge you perceive and the knowledge you produce. Okay, any questions about the triangulation, the styling and front-loading? Then, next I'll just give you a few kind of glimpses from the daily life of this new research center we have established called the Interacting Mind Center. And we have suggested to the university that we will do experimental research on cognition, communication, and choice. And we have kind of a core grant for 5 years from the university, and we're expected to act as some kind of a powerhouse for people from across the university who are interested in people interacting with each other, coming from different disciplines, and interested in working with each other. And some of the ways that we have thought about it in terms of organizing is it's inspired by ideas in network theory. And many of you probably know about the notions of small worlds, and the idea about small worlds is that a very economic way of organizing connections with each other is to have these kind of fairly dense networks that are closely connected within each other's and then links up to other hubs that are also fairly closely linked to each other. And if you do kind of the structure of them, you can see that these small worlds allow for separate processes, for segregation, and for integration. They're economical because there are actually not that many connections in them, but you can really quickly get from one node to the other node if you just know which kind of link that you're going to map out. One can argue that they support a high degree of dynamic complexity, and they seem relatively stable and resistant to disruptive changes. So we really think of our research center as, in a way, some kind of almost like a research network where we bring together people who are deeply founded inside of their disciplines and inside of their departments. But by getting together at least once a week with us, we create kind of a shared knowledge about what does this network look like. And it makes it really easy for people then to figure out, how am I to connect from this point here into this point here if I know the other people. Since all of these people here also have these kind of strong international links, then increasingly by building up kind of a shared understanding of such a system, we can see that maybe a researcher out here in London and another researcher out here in London might actually easily meet up with us in Aarhus, because that's in Aarhus that we have created the links that makes it possible to actually travel some of these distances. And when we thought about, how can you keep such a group together for 5 years, we decided not to structure it along research programs that run for all the 5 years, because we've previously seen that generates almost like silos of research, that just take them on and don't care about it. But instead we said maybe we would have a loose theme defining every year, not defining all the research, but defining the kind of research seminars, etc. For the first year we said it should be all about coordination. This is what we have right now. We spend an awful lot of time coordinating. Next year it will be about confusion. 14 and 15 will touch on conflicts, and hopefully we'll end on cooperation. And the idea was also that this was probably also be mapping up the type of dynamics we would be experiencing within the center. But so far it seems kind of relatively successful to have that kind of general idea of a theme running across the year. This means that no matter where people come from, when we're bringing researchers, we have some criteria to say should they come this year or should they come next year. And finally, we have some overarching ideas about modeling and about meta-reflections and analysis. Okay. But I think, what we have increasingly been learning is that actually a lot of interdisciplinary work is also very low practical. It's also about people coming together and creating situations where it makes sense for people to come together and to exchange with each other. And one kind of critical instrument that we have seen developing for that are some regular seminars every Tuesday that are always concluded with a free sandwich for everyone coming in there. And the free sandwich means that people need to go for lunch anyway. So very economic people, they might as well join in for the seminar. But it also means that there is always kind of half an hour after the talk where you know you can get in touch with other people and you can create those kind of contexts. So I really think in these interdisciplinary collaborations, no matter whether, as in our instance, it's people co-located, or as it's probably going to be many of the projects, it's people located into different places, thinking about the type of also social rituals that makes it meaningful for you to come together on a regular basis. At least my understanding has been quite critical, because these is also the gaps that allows one to come up with ideas and kind of project things into the future. We've also noticed at these seminars that at the end of the day, as researchers, probably most of us also have a very kind of competitive strike, sometimes almost a predatory kind of style to it. And what we can see from people coming in to present in that audience is that if they don't throw something on the table, something that people can get their teeth in, and the group can either start eating the presenter or start beating each other before they get to the session. Whereas what we have seen kind of as an emergent strategy is that actually what is always useful in these situations is if people come and present something that they haven't quite digested yet, and that allows people in the room to work along with and think along with. That seems to be where interdisciplinary groups are at its best. It also means that there are discussions that can be really difficult to take within these things. So sometimes it's important to do stuff that's very conceptual, sometimes stuff that's very theoretical, and that can be extremely difficult to do in these settings, because people will often front load the kind of preconditions they have, and we might not have the competencies to actually follow those discussions. So there is certainly also a danger for a certain kind of dumbing down of the discourses if all discussions have to take place within some interdisciplinary settings. But it might be useful to try out and be kind of reflexive about, well, which of the meetings that one organizes seems actually to be productive, and which of them seems to be not productive. And if they're not productive, but it's a topic that are relevant and interesting, how on earth would one then come about doing it differently? What we have people studying interactions under normal circumstances and disorders, and that's close collaborations with clinical sections. All the usual stuff you have to say in applications to take funding. But I'll come up with a recent study, a kind of an emergent study that's going on here to give you some ideas about how we can suddenly see ideas developing because people meet up on a regular basis in these topics. And this was a study that I didn't hear about until the first data were really collected. The whole model was clear, and at first I felt really angry about it. So why hadn't anyone told me? And then I realized that actually this is a dream come true, that these things just emerges around you. So it's a study on clinical prosody, studying prosody, studying tones in different clinical populations. And it has brought together people who has a lot of methods in conversational dynamics. And then it turned out that basically we had run similar studies within a number of clinical groups. So there were prosody and social cognition, people with right hemisphere damages, social cognition in schizophrenia, language cognition in Asperger's, and in depression. And these people suddenly came together and said, well, we do a comparative study of prosodic structures between populations. And this is relevant because it's kind of well known in the clinical literature that people with different disorders tend to have different voices. It has the voice of the autistic person and the very monotone voice of the depressed person, etc. It hasn't really been quantified about. So basically they set about analyzing in a very automatic way how people would be describing some of these films that many of you have probably seen, like triangles chasing each other around. It didn't really matter what they were seeing, but they were basically seeing the same thing. And then applying to this the recurrence analysis that we saw previously, and then see are there any kind of particular patterns happening in how these people are talking about this in a lot of the program, the recurrence part of the Asperger's, the right hemisphere damage because it's schizophrenia information. And again, kind of just eyeballing it, it seems as if there are different structures involved in it. And once they started to do kind of a more formal approach of it, and looking at so canonical discriminant functions and then turning that into a learning algorithm, then by simply looking at two different parameters here, it was possible more or less to identify these different groups into a two-dimensional landscape, and using a setting up a classification neural network with something like between 80 and 90% certainty, individuals could be placed into these different groups here based only on a recurrence analysis of the talking about particular things. So this would be, I think, a very beautiful instance of something that would be completely unanticipated. It happened because we had developed certain tools that were used across a number of different fields here. Some people in linguistics have built up amazing competences doing recurrence analysis and using mathematics of it. And suddenly they came together and said, well, actually, there are potential tools here to look very systematically at something which is known from the classical literature, which is very interesting in terms of structures of communication that might potentially be relevant also for doing a rapid diagnosis of different situations. And here we have basically the lessons of an emerging project. So I think the lessons that can be learned from this and from other studies is that it seems important to identify a relevant topic, not surprisingly, and then basically to throw all available tools and competencies at it, interact across disciplines and experiences. And I think what we have increasingly seen also is to remember also that disciplines and methods need not be entirely up together. So for historical reasons, in the neuroimaging community in Aarhus, we never really got the psychologists on board, because the psychologists in Denmark haven't had a strong experimental tradition and have not been very interested in the neuro stuff. So it was people coming from semiotics and linguistics and philosophy who became interested in playing around with those tools here. So now kind of some of the best competences in EEG is currently in the linguistics department. The recurrence analysis is shared between philosophy and mathematics. It's kind of an uncommon mix of competencies and methods and questions that goes together. And that just seems to open up the field for other things here. And I think we're increasingly starting to think of the work we're doing as not so much interdisciplinary, but rather post-disciplinary. And what seems to be going on in these post-disciplinary settings is precisely that kind of link between methods and questions that has formed so much of our training into particular disciplines are getting disjunct from each other. And I think that opens up for much more interesting landscapes in terms of practice. So the next story I will tell very briefly about is something that we have seen coming up also from some of the changes in research policies in Denmark, is that increasingly we are asked to do work with businesses in the university. In particular, if you want to go to these large strategic trends, you should somehow figure out how can you make yourself relevant to society. And I was in panels where we were funding that kind of research, but I had never really done it myself. The innocence of not having played with the industry. And we looked around and thought, if we were to lose our innocence to the industry, under which conditions would we do it? And right next to Aarhus University is the Lego factory and the Lego Learning Institute. We thought maybe a toy factory wouldn't be the worst part of it. Hang on first. So as part of an EU project, we got in touch with Lego and said it was a project on embodied intersubjectivity, and I convinced them that this was something they should know something about were they to develop the toys of the future and not just the toys of the present. And we had no money floating between us, but the initial idea was to say, well, maybe they have some ideas for something that works inside of their organization that we could turn into experiments and that they could then in turn use to do interesting, get them new knowledge about what breaks were about. And it turns out that inside of Lego and kind of branching out of it, they had developed a management tool called Lego Serious Play, and some of you might have tried it in various business-like settings. And the idea is basically that if a group of people have to kind of create a new sense, a new understanding of what they're doing, then they basically build it in Lego together. It might be a company, two companies merging, it might be a development department having to build a strategic department. And then through a series of exercises, we try to take abstract ideas and say, well, what would it look like if we built it in bricks? And then one of the rules of the game is that you can only talk about things that are already in the bricks. You know, if you want to convince other people about this being relevant, then you have to build something in bricks that you can talk to. And we thought this was potentially a very interesting way to do something that we were interested in, namely that when people are doing stuff together, much of the time we are also co-constructing worlds with each other, and these worlds are in a way affecting the way we're doing things. So we thought, could we somehow take this procedure that works so well that there is an army of Lego Serious Plays facilitators out there, and you can pay a lot of money to come and have you play with Legos inside your company, and then turn that into an experiment that could teach us something about co-constructions. And so what people were basically doing here was that they were basically building together, in this instance here, abstract concepts. We took them from the inaugural speech of our latest Prime Minister, all the buzzwords he said should characterize Danish society in the future. And it was words that we really didn't know what meant. And so we said to people, you should either in group or individually build these representations of authority or energy in the future. So that we might have. In building these things, this is an instance of something that came out of it. And then along the way we would be doing various forms of recurrence analysis of either the movements or here the heart rates to see is there something within the bodies of people who were doing these things together that gets unified. And this is a recurrence plot of heart dynamics for two people who are sitting next to each other individually building. Here is a group of people building two people here, and there seems to be some kind of structure. I won't go into the details of the synchronization, it's still very complex, but it seems that in these collectives doing building together, there is a build-up over time of synchronization of the heart rhythms relative to each other. We can talk about that, that's interesting. We wanted also to throw in an imaging component about it, because we were interested in what happens to objects when they start to acquire meaning. So the day after during the building, they were invited into the brain scanner to see images, photographs of what they had built. And this was stuff that they are either done individually or with a group, or that someone else had done individually or with a group. And then they should basically look at the images and rate them among two different criteria. Either interpretability, so how well does this particular object match the signature mass of democracy, or how robust or how fragile is it. And there is a ton of different things coming out of that. We won't go into details, but one finding that I think is partly interesting is that in those objects that people have been involved in constructing either individually or with a group in contrast to the others, when they were seeing those objects in that situation where they were estimating is this something that is a good description of a particular phenomenon, we saw medial prefrontal cortex, temporal parietal junction, precuneus, areas that one would typically associate with self-activated areas. This is a long discussion, but this is self or research cognition. So in other words, it was as if the objects out there in a way became kind of markers of those cells that had been involved in the living. And we thought that was an interesting way of saying something about how objects that you have constructed yourself in a way come to carry to yourself traces of the things that have come to you. We keep doing other things. With Lego here was a task that Lego asked us to do. They have an annual workshop where they fly in people that work on Lego from all over the world to Billund to show them some of their new technologies. And they have come up with what I thought was really interesting ideas. The designers basically wanted to introduce the new Lego creative cars that looks here. And the task was that two people together should build a car together that could run as long as possible down the ramp and jump over a crocodile and then go as fast as possible down there. And the trick that the designers had come up with, and I don't know how they came up with that, I mean, was to say, well, but you know, if people should do it together, we will physically turn them into one unit by simply tying people up to it. I was building Jewel, our hands would be tied up, and I would move to my left hand, and she would her right hand. And that was not an idea that we had thought of ourselves at all, but it was a really interesting instance of something we were interested in, namely what happens to people, do they become some kind of a coupled system when they do things together? Here they were quite literally coupled together. And then those of you who are familiar with the ongoing literature of joint action, and a lot of the current thinking about joint actions is to say that the more people get into synchrony with each other, the more happy they feel about it and this supports collaboration. So we were very simply mapping hand movements between these two hands that we were building with very simple motion detectors, and using recurrence analysis to ask the question, is there anything in the patterns of synchrony that predicts two different things, namely how far did the car race and how much did they like the collaboration? And very kind of contrary to what we had expected, then actually there was in both instances a significant inverse correlation between the similarity of the hand movements and how well the task was solved and how much people enjoyed it. Now that goes against a lot of the current ideas about joint action, which kind of emphasizes synchronization, but it falls very much in place with all ideas about divisions of labor, even during more complex situations. And it's for sure that we had never come up with this particular idea hadn't we been in collaboration with labor designers who thought, well, there's something interesting that you could throw an experiment in. So our first take on it has been that doing with stuff with the industry can also be really interesting from a scientific point of view, because it can allow us to tap into things that they know work and that we can then use to construct something about that's useful for our functions. But of course, I mean, the industry is industry, and one shouldn't be too naive about it. We had a really interesting lesson in that the first time we did the Lego Serious Play study of people building abstract concepts together. Because in the first instance of it, it was a completely crazy idea. But Aarhus University was running some summer schools for PhD students, and one of them was research leadership. So that was for very ambitious young PhD students from all over the world who should come to Aarhus and learn something about research leadership. And as part of that, they had thrown in a 3-day module of interdisciplinarity. And we thought, what should we do with them for those 3 days? Thinking was that, well, the best thing we could do was to actually make them take part in the experiment and see what is it like to work interdisciplinary by doing it first person, like go through the different steps, and then we would unfold around it some of the knowledge that had been produced with it. So we took a bus of PhD students to the Lego factory, and we gave them all these bricks here, and they were allowed to build these abstract concepts together. And then they were offered 2 days after to go into the brain scanner and then have their brain scans. And we had done all we thought was necessary in terms of ethical approval from the ethics committee. So they had to sign an informed consent if they were to go into the scanner, as you have to do in those situations. And we were documenting the type of building exercises they were doing and photographing all the stuff that they were making. And what we hadn't realized, of course, was there were 2 American law students, PhD students, in the group. And after a while, they said, well, but you know, this is our product. We've built these things here. This is our version of democracy, and you just taking pictures of it inside of Lego, which is a multi-billion-dollar, very successful privately owned company. What are they going to do with our products at the end of the day? You haven't asked us about the intellectual property rights that come out of the stuff that we are doing here, and they were perfectly right. I mean, we hadn't thought about it at all. For us, Lego was just the company next door. It was not a multi-billion-dollar company. But the moment that idea was kind of floating around in the room, everybody raised our hand and said, no, we haven't been properly informed of what we're doing. What is the hidden agenda in that? Are you working for us? Are you working for Lego? Is this experiment for us, or is it for you? Who is treating who in that situation? So that failed experiment, I think, was for us a very interesting instance of, yes, of course, Lego was not just the nice toy company next to us, it's a multi-billion-dollar private company which is very successful. And there are all sorts of instances involved in it. Here they might have been relatively innocent, but potentially they were right about it. As any other company, they follow very different strategies from what we have been working with. So that was, in a way, coming from the research process, I think an interesting instance of what is it that one should be aware of in such situations. So, when Barry suggested that I came and speak here, he kind of gave me a short brief about what the project was about. And he said, guys, we don't ask much of them. We say they should build reciprocal relations, it should be transformative research, it should be innovative, it should be international. And then he said, we know, it's kind of a high bar, but I'm sure that they can make it. Now, going back at that list, looking at the type of experiences we have had in building a club, then clearly the international thing, that's a really, really easy requirement to meet. And particularly for you being in the UK, it's a really easy one, because everyone from continental Europe wants to play with you, because we want to speak your language, and publish the best journals, and set in many ways the standards of research. So it should be incredibly easy for anyone from a British university to be international. That's kind of trivial. Being innovative, maybe it's actually not too difficult. Particularly once you actually bring people together across disciplines and try out to loosen some of the classical rigid ways of doing work, then it seems that some aspect of innovation might almost come by itself, and particularly when it is a field where not a lot of work has been done before. Because here kind of very trivial ideas in one area might be really innovative and useful in another area. So it seems that at least maybe a shallow level of innovation, trying out things that haven't been tried before, comes quite easily with the interdisciplinarity. Transformative, well, that's of course a much, much tougher criterion to establish. If by transformation you think that the discipline of the subfield isn't going to look the same as it did beforehand. I'm not sure we have done any work that's transformative. We have in a few instances suggested that you might think differently about what to do by introducing these kind of methods, but transformation is probably a tough one to do, no need time also. But maybe the most complicated one to do is actually the reciprocal relations. I think in our experiences, it's almost impossible. In almost every situation, kind of one of the persons would feel that it can. So if by reciprocal you mean the idea that both of the people will come out and have given something to the other that the other find useful, or you have received something that you find useful, and both of your disciplines have been transformed. So I think quite rightly, for instance, if many of my anthropologists look at the study of firewalking, they would say, yeah, you know, it's kind of interesting that you find these couples in artists. So A, we knew that already, and B, you know, anthropology has moved a long way since the Clarence in the 1910s, right? The world looks different today. So why are you kind of reinventing stuff that we abandoned maybe 40 or 50 years ago? You're really just taking old ideas and importing them into a different field. That's not a reality. Similarly, we have had a lot of discussions in the imaging community between the people who have the access to the machines and to the computations and those who ask questions about who is really running the show here. Is it the people with the scanners who can recruit people in who can ask questions and use that to get into science or nature or into other places? Or are the people with the scanners merely technicians that can help these other people to do the kind of research that they're already doing? And these things become, at some point, they become quite bitter and quite adversive, and that can become like particularly to write up stuff together and figure it out. So I think the reciprocal relations, maybe also because of the things that are involved in it, is a really, really hard bar to rise, at least in the short level. Another thing to acknowledge is probably that there is also an awful lot of knowledge politics involved in these things here. And I think what we have increasingly tried to do in situations where people that might be strong personal conflicts, or these issues about reciprocality comes up, is to try to figure out, well, what is it actually that's at stake in it? Which kind of fundamental issues related to the type of training one has, the values one has, etc., is it that builds it up? And sometimes that can create more interesting and more complex knowledge politics, where each of one are not only fighting the others, but also ends up along the way to be involved in those people. So I think reciprocality is a very, very strong measure. So it's worth to think about, but Habermas' idea about the whatever it's called in English, the type of relations without any kind of power relations to them might not be your typical standard of interactions in sciences and all other situations. There are always these issues of power involved and related to it, because of the funding bodies, because of the resources that you draw in. And being naive to that is basically that you turn to something that could otherwise be potential. And it might, I think, be much more a matter of being quite effective and specific about, well, the knowledge that's really, how do you situate it? How do you understand the situation in it? So here is a picture of a sleep researcher looking at an image of the brain, and that brain is also our own brain, and you could say, well, you know, is this a matter of induction? Probably not. It's not that she gets reduced to that unit of the brain in here. It seems to be a much more complex situation of coming up with the type of mappings into new knowledge. There's a different setting of people and technologies and powers, etc. together. And doing interdisciplinarity means also to produce these type of knowledge. One way that we are currently thinking about that is to say, as you saw in the subtitle, we call our center that we did experimental research. But at least in my understanding of it, it means to think of the experimental along three different dimensions. So experimental can be a method as an experimental psychology. But you can also think of the experimental as an aesthetics, as an aesthetic arts. And here the experimental is really about moving the boundaries of how one is doing things currently. But finally, at least as an anthropologist, you can also think of the experimental as an object of study, so not just as cultures can be an object of study. And here the issue becomes really a matter of what is it that goes on when experiments are made? What is it that happens when this becomes a key way of making knowledge? What goes in there, what couldn't go in there, what are the constraints? And within anthropology, which I probably consider my whole tradition, it's becoming kind of increasingly relevant to think about how do we do these kind of interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary collaborations. And George Marcus, who is one of those people who have kept redefining the discipline over the last 20 years, he has argued for people not doing old-fashioned fieldwork where you come out and have strong ideas about how primitives are, but rather that what one is doing in those situations, and anthropology is here is one instance of what I think a lot of humanity is doing in these situations. This is situations where one works in what's called parasites, where ethnographer works at sites of knowledge production with others, with patrons, partners, and subjects of research at the same time. And that's probably what we're going to see in a lot of these things here. Now, these spaces can help generate unexpected ways of speaking and thinking with moderately empowered people who are implicated in great social transformations. And I think that shift towards seeing what we are actually experiencing is that in these collaborations, we end up co-constructing a reality that's really none of our own already. And one of the ways to avoid some of the obstacles is to develop with each other also some kind of language about what is it that goes on in these situations, and really help to turn the research into something interesting. And also in those situations where the project fails, this allows you still to get something interesting. So to conclude, I started out by saying there's something about styles that seems to characterize sensitive fields. And a good question to ask oneself is, well, which kind of ballroom is it actually that you're dancing in when you're dancing?
We have some time for questions, and I hope you will exploit Andreas's experience to ask. So can I just say something about reciprocal first? So I think if you have in reciprocal the idea of equality, which seems to sneak into that, then that is almost impossible. Yeah. But if you have the idea of bi-directional working, and each really feeling they did get something from the other, that made a significant difference to that field, or to their way of working, or to something they've found out, that's what's expected.
And that's good, and that's not unattainable, but I would then probably step one back, go one step back and also look about the practice. Yeah. Because you say, if that should have been reciprocal, it should also be reciprocal at the funding. Yeah. Because reciprocity is also a matter of exchanging gifts with each other. And in that sense, the reciprocality at a structural point isn't really there in the first place. And that's, I think it's probably also shaping some of the ways of this project.
I think that may be true, but I think you have to see this theme, and I'm speaking in very dangerous grounds with my colleagues around, as a bit of a Trojan horse. Yes. We want to get inside the belly of the beast, and then we want to see whether or not people seeing the value of this will agree that funding should be flowing and that they should be supporting it. There was a funny moment in the outline panel, I think it's not preaching any conference to say, where somebody said, well, if I look at the shortlisted candidates, that means we might be spending some money on science. And I said, did you read the call? Did you see what we were trying to do? So I think if you are insisting on reciprocal relations to begin with, and if you're the one doing it, you're the council doing it, you really have to sign up at the beginning to say, yes, we'll make commitment to some money's flowing towards the sciences, but clearly the hope is to make a difference and unlock some real reciprocity and funding beyond that point, and I think that will happen. Colin.
Can I take up what you said, what you called styling?
Yeah.
And I guess what one might also call jargon, because I think in our area anyway, I think it's incredibly important, because recognising the jargon that academics use to talk about their subject is a kind of, it's a symbol of approval, it's a membership club. You can quickly move through jargon to an understanding of what the other person is referring to. You trust each other more, you can conduct your conversation much more quickly. Huge difficulty across disciplines, because each side has its own set of terminology, its own style, its own grammar, its own lexicon. In some cases, the words map onto each other. It's only a matter of learning the dictionary, or the conversion, the translation between the two. In other cases, they're quite different, and they're very easily misunderstandings, particularly when the word is the same as it can be. Like the word, for instance, the word map, which has become a very contentious issue of discussions between neuroscientists and philosophers about the meaning of a map as a representation. You need a map reader in order to understand it, or it's just a piece of terminology for a form of representation of the brain. So I think, as far as we're concerned, getting to grips with each other's jargon and really working that through, acknowledging what we mean by words is a really important first step.
I would entirely agree there, and I think actually writing together with each other is a really interesting exercise. And I think in many instances we have taken the somewhat cowardly approaches to say, well, okay, then maybe the same study, which is too rich or goes along many dimensions, it can't really fit into one particular criterion or one particular style, but we can write up the same stuff differently, focusing on different aspects of it. And that's kind of the somewhat cowardly way that we have done it, not phasing the styles out there, but saying, well, maybe it's a matter of them thinking about if there are other aspects of it that doesn't fit in there, it can go into a different discourse. And particularly that's where working in teams can be useful, because always it's really difficult for oneself to master several different styles. But working together gives an enormous palette if you can kind of share the trust in each other.
About your Tuesday meetings with sandwiches. How do you organise that as a series of meetings? Do you just set the theme and then invite people to come on and talk on the theme, or are you more directed?
So here I basically know kind of a month in advance who's going to be the next speakers, and it might be someone from the group who has experiments they want to study, or ideas they want to study, or someone that we can light in that we bring in. It's a little bit random who is there. I can see that's kind of depending on who is there. Of course, it's a different topic, but there seems to be enough people who would even attend the seminar that's not directly down their alley, either because there's a sandwich waiting or because the meeting is also useful for other things. And along that way, that basically builds up shared knowledge that goes way beyond what each of us can find otherwise. Those meetings have been going on, I think, for like 7 or 8 years now, like almost every Tuesday. And as an institution, it just seems an incredibly good tool to also keep coordinating with the other consultants. What's the state for something?
Yes.
Thank you. I've enjoyed that very much. I'm interested in the whole question of conflict and how you deal with that, handle it, and whether it's sensible way up front to say, look, guys, there are going to be times and maybe times it's highly likely that we are going to experience some kind of conflict, and we may be able to work out. But what's the best way of brokering that and negotiating that? What do you think is effective?
I don't think I have kind of much blend that works. Some of the conflicts, I think we've tried. There might be conflicts in all the teams and stuff like that. Then kind of confronting them quite early might be quite useful. But I would say that there are other of the conflicts that are more of a knowledge politics stuff. And they seem as unsolvable as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But we're not going to solve that tomorrow. There are too much training, there's too much resources, too many other things kind of tied up to it. But in those situations, what seems to be the solution then is to then come up with situations where we actually need each other in order to do these kind of things. And although you might still disagree about other stuff, then the pragmatics of it can sometimes solve. And in other instances, people basically part ways because the way you do research is not random. there can be really good reasons for doing something, and really good reasons, bad reasons, or reasons not to do something. That scientific is just so there's also certainly a kind of within the group, there are certain people who probably over time realize that what they want to do and the way they want to do research might be a little bit and they will go out and do it. So I don't think there is a one solution fix all.
I would imagine people joining a multidisciplinary would be more disposed to working collaboratively. So it sort of would be less complex. More disciplinary capability. So get on very well.
Well, I mean, so it looks, I think if you look at research projects, we seem to have experienced relatively few problems, and sometimes you don't perform or other people don't perform, but there is the intentions to reach out and do something about it. I guess where it becomes more critical is more once the interdisciplinarity becomes part of an institutional setting. And there might be political reasons for why people want you to work with someone else, or there might be strategic reasons that comes about. And then I think the issue becomes more complicated. Increasingly also, since a substantial part of the funding structure is directed to stuff that has an interdisciplinary addressing, it becomes really difficult. How should you do that? So you could, for instance, imagine in this situation here that it comes from the Arts and Humanities Research Council. At the end of the day, that's those who are going to decide who's going to see themselves. There is, of course, a danger that whoever comes in from the sciences might, in a way, be. They would probably know that they're in it for other reasons than what they do primarily. And similarly, I think we have seen also in many of the high-powered technological projects where you want to throw in an ethics component or relevance to society component, that really strange things can happen around it. So, in a way, some external boundaries and external constraints are forcing people into collaborations that strategically might make sense, but it really different.
I mean, I think the point's good that when people are already predisposed to do multidisciplinary work, that's fine. But they may come with a different idea of what that space for interdisciplinary working is. It reminds me of an EC-funded project called Eurotra, which happened in the sort of late 80s, early 90s. It was machine translation. The idea was, instead of translating between all the different languages many times, we'd all convert into an interlanguage, and then that would be converted back into each of the other languages. Great idea. What was that interlanguage like? Well, to the English it looked like English, to the Dutch it looked like Dutch, and the French just wanted to know if people enjoyed the text. So, you can have that desire, but if you actually all have very different conceptions of what the interdisciplinary space is, I think that can emerge slowly, and then you get the conflict, confusion, and have to work very hard to reconcile it. But it's hard won.
But I mean, still, I think it can be a really enjoyable way of working together, because it drives with it that potential kind of innovation and learning from each other, which is for me a major part of being a research.
Yes, picking up on what you were saying about the problems and possibilities of dumbing down.
Yeah.
Because I was thinking that I've been attending a group on medicine and literature with lots of medical figures attending.
Yeah.
And what happens is it's very interesting, but for literary scholars, it's not raising the bar at all.
Yeah.
And so how you negotiate this so that you can actually have both sides feeling that they're really learning rather than having to translate one across the other.
I think that's a critical issue, and I guess the way I try to think about it myself is that I would probably see anthropology and not neuroscience as my kind of core whole discipline. And I would then see that I need also a space of people trained in that discipline that I can come back to and reflect and discuss with on things where, in a way, that seems to be relevant within the discipline. So I think having a core disciplinary place where new ideas are being developed and keep thinking about oneself as someone that also has to contribute there is kind of making that possible, because then you do a division of labor. It's not all your life that's about translating, but some of it also kind of needs to feed back onto where those ideas came from in the first place. At least that's been my own solution to it. But critically, I mean, people also coming from the medical businesses will also say, well, you're you're studying pain, for instance, but that has absolutely nothing to do with the pain we're interested in people, for instance, have chronic pains. So in some instances, actually taking those discussions on dumbing down, on conflating the concepts, once you start to know each other, has, I think, been quite productive and have moved projects in different directions. But it doesn't always work.
I was just wondering, do you think that it's important that some of the publications that are coming out of interdisciplinary work are joined the author?
Yeah, I think that's very important. But of course, once you do that, you have the whole issue then of authorship lists. So you know who comes first, who comes last,
and also very different conceptions.
Very different conceptions, and I don't think you probably need to take that up front, right? And you know, for a while it was quite easy because people would say, if you were contributing to, let's say, an imaging journal as someone coming from philosophy, you would happily sneak in the middle, and then the people with the scanners could be the first and the last author. But then, if you're in as a humanist, then after a while you actually want to get credentials as someone who are also contributing to that field. You know, you can't only be stuck in the middle. But the moment you start asking for some of those other positions, you're quite likely to see that interesting stuff goes on if you want to be the first one or the last one. So that's what typically happens in the medical field. I think what typically happens in the more humanities-based fields is you just don't get asked to become an author. Right? So you know, you will do the collaborations as a philosopher or as an anthropologist with your people, but you won't even ask them to be co-authors on the paper because you do the writing. So it's not that one style of negotiating authorship evades the problems, but the rules of the game just seems to be played out very differently. And I don't think we have a clear answer to it, other than trying to be somewhat reflexive about it. It is people doing these things together, and the publications are some of the currencies coming out of that, and trying to understand also which kind of constraints go into the evaluations of them. Maybe one of the ways to negotiate.
That was a big major learning experience when I realized being a final author on a 5-author paper, experimental paper, was actually supposed to be a privilege. Too hard to get now.
So and if you go with the economy, they seem to go for alphabetical ordering all the time. But the economist is not alphabetical ordering, that's instantly out here. So at least that's, I think, is our strategy, is then to try to turn it into also realization of the cultural differences in the field and what goes on here. What's at stake? How can we make something that becomes reciprocal to all parties that trust it?
It's also the difficulty, because I work as a scientist, and as a lawyer, I need to write something that's 10,000 words, otherwise nobody's interested in my field. Whereas my science partner, he is horrified by that idea, and he thinks 2,500 words is already too much, and so that it has been difficult trying to negotiate.
It can, and I think it's important also in flexible visions that those styles are not just things in your head and in your perception. It's also very concrete in how do you write up stuff. What counts as an argument? How long would a paper need to be for it to convince other people? Do you need figures and artwork? And within disciplines, there are fairly good reasons why things have evolved the way they have evolved, but they can be difficult to cross. Co-writing can be a challenge, it can sometimes be an experience, but that's kind of the learning part of it.
So I'm aware we've eaten our promised quarter of an hour of time, but I think given that we have a certain amount of flexibility in the program, maybe we can resume, all of us, at 2:15, but if you were here at 2 to make yourselves available for these one-to-one discussions, that would be great. We've had the theory, we're going to move to the practice because we're going to together, but first let's thank Andreas very much again.